VisualPolitik community, we have some very bad news to tell you. Jihadism is making a comeback. Or at least, that is what many experts in both Europe and the United States are already warning. The vast majority of analysts claim that the phenomenon is experiencing a new boom. The reason? I'm sure you can already guess. 3, 2, 1. Exactly. We are talking about the red-hot situation in which Israel and Palestine, or rather Hamas, find themselves. But hadn't jihadist terrorism disappeared? No, nothing could be further from the truth. If you are loyal followers of VisualPolitik, you'll remember that in places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan, attacks are the order of the day. And let's not forget Africa. The Sahel is infested with jihadist terrorists. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. In fact, Boko Haram, one of the most well-known global jihadist terrorist groups, is based in Nigeria. Even in China, they have some problems with this issue. So where exactly do we say it is making a comeback? Well, particularly in Europe. In fact, since the Hamas attack on Israel and Israel's counter-offensive, we have come across news items like these. And believe me, it's no trivial matter.
France raises attack alert after Islamist kills teacher in northern France. Alert in Italy. Reinforced surveillance in places related to the Jewish community. Sweden raises terror alert level after Koran burnings. Denmark and Sweden have tightened border controls as they fear high-threat attacks.
In Europe, a little over 10 years ago, we had already experienced what it was like to suffer a jihadist attack every few years. In the end, the phenomenon lost more and more strength until the pandemic flattened it. Nevertheless, this time, it may be different. Analysts are already warning of the new forms that jihadist terrorism has taken in recent years. Forms that are even more elusive and more successful than in the past. And precisely because of this, we on VisualPolitik have posed a few questions. How did Europe manage to combat the wave of jihadism that devastated it a few years back? Are we really facing a new wave of jihadist terrorism on the old continent? Why might new forms of jihadism pose a greater risk to Europe than previous ones? Today, we're going to answer all these questions. But in order to do so, we have to first look back in time. Let's get started.
Europe in the face of terror.
Did you know that in Europe, jihadist terrorism caught almost everyone by surprise? The old continent was accustomed to another type of terrorism, one of a more nationalistic and political nature, such as that of ETA in Spain, or the IRA in the United Kingdom. However, the truth is that the European surprise was by no means justified. Some jihadist fighters had already begun to penetrate the old continent in the 1980s, and it did not take long for them to start extending the networks of larger groups, such as the Algerian Islamist group, or Al-Qaeda itself. This is how Europe began to become an important jihadist nest. Initially, those networks, led mainly by Al-Qaeda, were organized in a hierarchical manner, but following the September 11th attacks in New York, Osama bin Laden decided to completely change that structure. Faced with the US counterterrorism strategy aimed at eliminating the leaders of the organization and global jihadism, the networks were decentralized. But why? Quite simply, if bin Laden and the rest of the ringleaders were taken out, global jihadism could continue to function without any problem. What's more, it would be much more difficult to track and combat. As a result, Europe experienced a significant increase in anti-terrorist operations that dismantled some cells. For example, in January 2003, 2 small jihadist cells were dismantled in Italy. And in Spain the same year, the famous Operation Largo took place in several locations in Catalonia, leading to the dismantling of a medium-sized Algerian cell. Even so, as the decentralization strategy was implemented, everything became much more complicated. Nothing prepared Europe for what was to come. On 11th of March 2004, a jihadist cell attacked in Spain's capital, Madrid, with 10 bombs planted in different sections of public transport. The attack killed 193 people and injured more than 2,000. It was the second largest terrorist attack in the history of the continent. As you can imagine, this was a turning point in how Europe perceived jihadist terrorism. Concern about this issue reached historic levels that continue to grow after the London subway bombing the following year, in 2005, which killed another 50 people and injured some 700. Since then, Europe has been on a very high level of alert. The old continent suffered some minor attacks and thwarted some major ones, such as the one that 14 jihadists linked to Al-Qaeda had planned in the Barcelona subway in January 2009. 2008. However, despite all this, in 2014, we would encounter news that would take jihadist activity in Europe to unparalleled levels.
ISIS rebels declare Islamic State in Iraq and Syria.
Indeed, ISIS declared the Islamic State, and global jihadism reached its peak. Jihadist terrorism spread across the globe, and in Europe it hit particularly hard. And so began the first jihadist wave that Europe has experienced as such. So, VisualPolitik viewers, attacks in European Union countries soared, and with them the fatalities. 347 between 2015 and 2017 alone. 86 of them just in the brutal 2016 Nice attack. And it's not just about the victims. Little by little, these attacks fed a general sense of fear. Nevertheless, between the progressive weakening of ISIS from 2017, and both joint and individual efforts by European countries, the jihadist threat in Europe began to fall sharply. To give you an idea, in 2022, only 6 attacks took place. But now the Hamas attack on Israel and the Israeli response, particularly in Gaza, has brought tensions in the global Muslim community to a peak. Former Hamas leader Khaled Meshal went so far as to star in an ad that many analysts interpreted as a call for global jihad. Take note.
To all scholars who teach jihad for the sake of God and who preach the fighters and martyrs, to all who teach and learn, this is a moment of application of theories so that words are not just words.
As a result, both the governments of Europe and the United States have warned of a possible new rise in jihadist terrorism. But is this really a call for global jihad? Wasn't it supposed to be organizations like Al-Qaeda or ISIS that were doing this sort of thing? Well, let's take a look.
Global jihad resurfacing?
On 7th of October 2023, Hamas perpetrated one of the bloodiest terrorist attacks in Israel's history. More than 1,400 killed, including children, women, and the elderly. The images shocked the whole world. Many compared it to the harshest era of ISIS, including Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Hamas bound, burned, and executed children. They are savages. Hamas is ISIS, and just as the forces of civilization united to defeat ISIS, the forces of civilization must support Israel in defeating Hamas.
Since then, the Israeli counter-offensive has been definitive. It has entered Gaza and bombed hundreds and hundreds, thousands of targets. The global Muslim community has described this military response as genocide. And now, the vast majority of analysts fear that this is the perfect excuse for a mass call to jihad. The former Hamas leader has already done so. But do Mishal's words have any relevance? Well, probably yes. But enough to qualify it as a call for international jihad? Well, most likely not. For one simple reason. Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the ultimate representatives of global jihadism, love Hamas as much as a Muslim loves bacon. In other words, not at all. Yes, it is true. Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS are aligned on certain points. Their hatred of Israel, their perception of the Hebrew country as a puppet of the West, and the promotion of violence against the Jewish community are some of them. But the reality is that the relationship between these groups is pretty lousy. Since Hamas participated in the Palestinian Legislative Council elections in 2006, both Al-Qaeda and ISIS have harshly criticized the Palestinian organization. The two leading exponents of global jihadism condemned the participation of Hamas in a democratic process that both described as impure. What's more, Hamas's slowness and gradualism in imposing Sharia law in Gaza has been another major source of criticism from the other two terrorist groups. On top of that, Hamas's rapprochement with Iran and Hezbollah has not been particularly helpful in rebuilding its ties either. In fact, ISIS is particularly harsh on Hamas, which it criticizes for not having as its clear objective the establishment of a global Islamic State, but rather prioritizing the liberation of Palestine. Meanwhile, Al-Qaeda has differentiated between the political arm of Hamas, which it strongly condemns, and its militarized arm, the Qassam Brigades, which it does support. With such an eroded relationship, no matter how much Hamas may call for a global jihad, if its two main proponents do not support them, it is unlikely to take place. So, the question is, have both Al-Qaeda and ISIS called for a global jihad? Well, not completely, but they have come pretty close. You see, following the Hamas attack, Al-Qaeda applauded the action and took the opportunity to call for attacks on American targets in the Middle East, especially in the major cities of the countries that signed the Abraham Accords. ISIS, for its part, never congratulated Hamas and continued to criticize them for their ties with Iran. It did, however, take the opportunity to publish a list of Jewish targets to be pursued anywhere in the world. So whether this is a call for global jihad or not, it is a call for targeted violence. And you know what? It has already had and is having repercussions.
Egypt. Police officer shoots dead 2 Israeli tourists and Egyptian guide. An employee at the Israeli embassy in China has been stabbed. A foreign suspect is detained.
These are just 3 examples. Unfortunately, reports of anti-Semitic acts and terrorist attacks seem to be on the rise. And unsurprisingly, they have also reached Europe. Yet the problem in the old continent may be even greater than in the rest of the West. Why is that? Well, pay close attention.
Slippery jihadism.
Since the intense reactivation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, attacks by Islamist radicals have once again taken up weekly space in the international news. The cases of Egypt and China were among the first, but Europe, regrettably, has not been left behind.
Teacher killed and 2 injured in stabbing at school in northern France. Brussels shooting. Europe shaken after 2 Swedes shot dead. Germany arrests Islamist planning anti-Israel terror attack. A man previously sentenced for being a member of the so-called Islamic State has been arrested. According to prosecutors, he allegedly planned to carry out an Islamist-motivated attack on a pro-Israel demonstration.
All of them claimed to be acting on behalf of ISIS, and one of them already had strong ties to the international terrorist group. However, these cases reveal something much more important: the new face of jihadist terrorism that has been dominating Europe since the rise of ISIS. We are talking about the figure of the lone wolf. The lone wolf, which is an individual who has been radicalized autonomously and has had limited or no contact with terrorist cells, has been primarily responsible for terrorist attacks in Europe. For example, between 2014 and 2017, the years of the jihadist surge on the continent, 85% of all attacks were perpetrated by lone wolves. At this time, it is these terrorists that are the greatest threat to Europe for 2 reasons. Firstly, because their contact with terrorist cells is sometimes nil, and therefore makes their detection much more difficult. And secondly, because they can attack with everyday tools that do not arouse suspicion, such as knives. Without a doubt, they are a real headache for Western national security agencies. These new actors, potentially more dangerous than the terrorist cells that attacked Europe at the beginning of the century, are no joke. To give you an idea, right now, Spain alone is tracking at least 300 potential lone wolves. Crazy. For this reason, European intelligence and security agencies have been trying for some time now to combat this phenomenon in one of the areas that has generated the most lone wolves: social media and virtual spaces. You see, while the ISIS caliphate faded away almost completely physically, its virtual presence has never waned. In fact, during the quarantines in the first wave of COVID-19, its presence grew even stronger, and with it, online recruitment. This is of particular concern, as often lone wolves learn how to assemble explosive devices from various recruiters and virtual trainers. This was, for instance, the case of the Manchester bomber in 2017. On the other hand, the online propaganda of jihadism, although simple, has proven tremendously effective. By exploiting the identity confusion of many second-generation immigrants in European countries and installing a sense of victimhood against the supposed aggression of the West and its societies, the recruiters of global jihadism have been gaining more and more followers, and that means potential terrorists. Nevertheless, many analysts point to another place as a potential nest of jihadists: prisons. In fact, Mehdi Namouche, who was responsible for the 2014 bombing of a Jewish museum in Belgium, was radicalized during his 5-year prison sentence for robbery. You see, the fact is that in European prisons today, we find hundreds, if not thousands, of former ISIS fighters who left the old continent to fight in Iraq and Syria. Let's not forget that more than 6,000 European citizens went there. Well, analysts and national security agencies fear they are radicalizing other inmates in prisons, making prisons potential jihadist universities. And as if that were not enough, there are also warnings of the release of former European ISIS fighters. Many have already served their sentences, and at their time of release, it is not known exactly what level of radicalisation they are still at. So you see, VisualPolitik community, Europe seems to be about to embark on a new wave of jihadist terrorism. The risk is definitely on the table. The global Muslim community is on edge, and the radical message being spread by Al-Qaeda and ISIS has already permeated a minority, but absolutely problematic part of this community. Europe prevailed during the first wave of jihadist terrorism less than a decade ago, but today, lone wolves could put it in check. Their greater versatility makes the potential new jihadist wave in Europe more difficult to stem, forcing intelligence and homeland security agencies to reconfigure their counter-terrorism strategies. But at this point, the questions are now for you. Do you think that a new wave of jihadists will eventually reach Europe? How do you think it could deal with the challenge of the lone wolves? Do you see a possible new wave reaching the United States? You can leave me your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on VisualPolitik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel, hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it, and see you in the next one. All the best. See you soon.